If you have done inner child work, if you have reparented, if you understand where you come from, if you can explain your patterns intellectually, and you still find yourself sabotaging, shutting down, rebelling, or doubting yourself at the exact moments that matter most, you are not doing it wrong. And you are not stuck. There is simply just a part of the story that no one has prepared you for. Because what most people do not tell you is that inner child work, it explains why you learned to survive. But it does not explain why you learned to edit yourself. And that editing, it didn't happen when you were helpless. It happened when you were becoming someone. And this is where people get confused because they say, I understand my childhood. I know my parents. I know that they did their best and I've soothed my younger self. So why does this still show up? And you ask, why do I still hesitate when I want to be visible? And why do I still second guess myself when I choose differently? Or feel defiant towards structure? Or shut down when I feel misunderstood? Or lose confidence right when I am about to step forward? Why does it feel like something else takes over? Because it does. And it is not your inner child, it is your inner teenager. Maybe you've never heard that concept because it is a part that no one names. And it is not because it is not important, but because it is uncomfortable. It is messy, contradictory, proud, sensitive, sharp. It is protective. And this is the part of you that learned what it costs to be real. Your deepest patterns were not formed when you were helpless. They were formed when you were becoming someone, and the world responded to that. When you were old enough to feel shame, when you were old enough to be judged, when you were old enough to be misunderstood, when you were old enough to realize that expression had consequences. That is when you learned what parts of you were welcome, what parts needed to be hidden, what parts were too much, and what parts were unsafe to show. And this is where identity begins to harden. Inner child work is about safety. Inner teenager work is about dignity. And if dignity was compromised, no amount of soothing will resolve it. This is why people who have done years of healing work, they still feel an internal push and pull, and why they feel confident in some areas and completely destabilized in others. And it's also why they oscillate between I know who I am and why am I questioning myself again? Nothing is wrong. You are not regressing here. You are touching the layer where identity formed under pressure. And this part does not want to be fixed. It doesn't want to be calmed down. It doesn't want to be managed. It wants to be met. So if you have ever thought, I've done so much work, why does this still live inside me? This episode is for you. Because once you understand this layer, everything you have been blaming yourself for, it will just start to make sense. And when something makes sense in the body, it stops needing to fight you. Most people lump these parts together. They say inner child when they are actually meeting their inner teenager. And that is often why the work feels like it hits a ceiling. Your inner child is the part of you that needed safety. It is that part that learned that the world could just suddenly disappear, and that love could be inconsistent, and that care maybe wasn't always guaranteed. So your inner child therefore needed soothing, it needed reassurance, it needed protection, it needed attunement. And you give yourself that to heal your inner child if that wasn't given to you in your childhood. And it's also this part that asks, am I safe? Will you stay? And will I be okay? But your inner teenager is so much more different. It's very, very different. This part didn't just want to survive. This part wanted to exist. The inner teenager, what it needs is autonomy. It needs dignity, expression, and respect. This is the part that asks, am I allowed to be me? It's not the part that asks, will I survive? But it is the part that asks, can I take up space? Can I do what I want? Can I say what I want? Can I be seen without being shamed? And here's the most important part to understand. When the inner child does not feel safe, the nervous system contracts. When the inner teenager doesn't feel respected, the identity fractures. And this is where patterns form that do not respond to soothing. This is where self-sabotage lives. This is where defiance shows up, or when you start to over-explain something as a reflex, and that desire suddenly turns into shame. And also when visibility suddenly feels dangerous, and your confidence just collapses when you pressure yourself. And it is not because you are afraid. It is because you once learned that being yourself had consequences. So when people say, I don't know why I do this, they're often not touching fear, they are touching dignity wounds. This is why some of you can regulate beautiful. You can regulate beautiful until it is time to speak up, until it's time to choose differently or be seen or disappoint someone, maybe claim what you want. And that suddenly the ground just drops out, because the inner teenager isn't soothed by safety. They're soothed by respect. And when this part feels dismissed, managed, or overridden, it does not soften. It resists, it rebels, or disappears. And that's why affirmations bounce off, and why reassurance feels hollow, and why, quote unquote, you're safe now does not land. Because safety without agency feels suffocating to this part. Your inner teenager does not want to be calmed down. They want to be listened to without correction. They want their truth to be taken seriously. And when this part has not been met, it will keep interrupting adulthood. And not to ruin your life, but to protect something essential. So if you have been wondering why, quote unquote, I know better, but something still takes over, this is why. You're not fighting immaturity. You're meeting an identity that never felt allowed to fully form. And once this distinction lands, I don't talk about intellectually landing, but somatically, your patterns will stop feeling like personal flaws, and they start revealing where dignity was compromised. And that changes how you meet yourself entirely. There is usually a moment in adolescence that does not get remembered as a story. it gets remembered as a decision and not a conscious decision. It is a nervous system decision. And this is the moment when identity meets consequence, is the moment when expression meets rejection, and when truth meets misunderstanding, punishment, or silence. Up until then, up until that point, you are experimenting, trying things on, feeling into who you are. And then something happens. Maybe you were told that you were too much, too emotional, too intense, too sensitive, too expressive. Maybe you were misunderstood, your intentions twisted, your words taken the wrong way. Maybe your honesty was punished. Maybe your body was commented on, looked at, judged. Maybe it was sexualized, or maybe it was dismissed. Maybe you were forced to grow up too early, to be responsible, to be strong, to be sensible. And in that moment, the nervous system doesn't reflect. It adapts. It asks one question. What do I need to do to survive this and still belong? And it chooses a strategy. Some of you complied. You became agreeable. You became easy, low maintenance. You learned how to be palatable. And some of you rebelled. You pushed back, you acted out, you refused to cooperate, and you learned how to protect yourself through that opposition. And some of you disappeared. You went quiet, pulled inward, stopped expressing. You learned how to stay safe by not being seen. Some of you performed. You excelled, achieved, became impressive, and you learned how to earn approval instead of receiving it. None of these responses were wrong. They were intelligent. They worked. But what happened next is that strategy, it gets frozen in time because it wasn't chosen from freedom. It was chosen under pressure. And the inner teenager, it holds on to it. And it's not because they do not want to grow, but because they remember the cost of being real. And this is the part of you that learned, this is what happens when I show up fully. This is what happens when I tell the truth. This is what happens when I want something. So the inner teenager is not reckless. They are protective. They remember. And when adulthood brings you back to similar moments, like visibility, desire, choice, risk, expression, this part steps in automatically. Not to sabotage you, but to keep you from paying the same price again. And this is why these patterns do not respond to logic. They were formed before explanation, before language, before insight. And when you locate this moment, not as a memory, but as a felt decision, something shifts. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And you start seeing, that is when I learned who I had to be. And once you see that clearly, you're no longer fighting yourself. You're finally understanding what protected you. And I want to be careful here because inner child work do matter. Like, I've done it a lot. It is not wrong at all, and it's absolutely not outdated. It is not something you need to undo. For many of you, it is essential. It gives you safety. It gives you language. It gives you stability. It gives you a sense of ground. But inner child work doesn't reach everything. And when people sense that, they often turn the disappointment that comes up inward. And they think, I must be doing it wrong. I must be resistant to this, or I must not be healed enough. And that is not true. Inner child work soothes. And soothing is powerful. But the inner teenager, as I mentioned, it doesn't want soothing. Inner teenager wants respect. So that is the mismatch. When you try to reparent your inner teenager, it can feel off. patronizing, minimizing, like being talked down to. Because this part of you is not small, they're not helpless. This part of you is aware and they're opinionated. It is opinionated. It has a sense of self. So when you say things like, "You're safe now, everything is okay, I'm here to take care of you," the inner teenager, it doesn't soften to that. It literally pulls away or it pushes back. This is why affirmations often bounce off. And it is absolutely not because they are untrue, but they override agency. They tell this part what to feel instead of asking it what they feel. And safety without agency, that feels suffocating to the inner teenager. Being held without being heard, to the inner teenager, that feels like erasure. So if you have noticed that resistance, like you have a resistance to soothing practices, or you're just irritated with inner child language, or you have a discomfort when it comes to being told to calm down, that is not dysfunction. That is dignity protecting itself. And this part of you, it learned early that being real came with consequences. So it doesn't want to be managed. It wants to be met. You don't heal the inner teenager by holding them. You heal by listening to them. You heal it by listening without correcting and without reframing, without trying to make anything better. When this part finally feels respected, something incredible happens. The defiance, it softens, and the shutdown, it loosens, and the rebellion in that inner teenager just loses its job. And it is not because you controlled it, it is because you acknowledged it. So if inner child work didn't take you all the way, that is not failure, and it's absolutely very, very normal. And most importantly, it is information. It means you are ready to meet a more complex layer of yourself. One layer that does not need saving, it just needs recognition. And when dignity is restored, the nervous system stops needing to fight you. If you are honest with yourself, this part does not feel childish. It feels defiant, quietly, intelligently, strategically. It shows up as procrastination, but not the kind that comes from confusion or laziness. It is the kind that says, "You do not get to decide for me. You know what to do. You have planned it. You even want it." And still something drags its feet. And not because you don't care, but because the commitment feels like surrendering agency. And this part shows up as commitment anxiety. And it doesn't just show up in relationships, but it shows up in paths, in identities, in futures. Because once you commit, you feel trapped. And this part, it learned very early that being trapped meant being misunderstood. So it shows up as authority issues. Like you don't like being told what to do, even by people you respect, even by systems you choose, or even by versions of yourself who know better. You have an internal, like, "don't manage me." And it often also shows up as fear of being guided, or that advice feels intrusive, that support feels conditional, and that structure feels controlling. And suddenly you are finding yourself resisting help that you actually ask for. And it also shows up as self-doubt right when things matter the most, right before you speak, right before you step forward, right before you choose differently. Your confidence collapses, and it is not because you are incapable, it is because visibility activates memory. This is the inner teenager saying that last time I was seen, it cost me. So you question yourself, you over-explain, you second-guess, you minimize, and not because you do not trust yourself, but because this part learned that certainty was dangerous. This is not immaturity. It is an identity that never felt met. You are not fighting laziness. You are meeting a part that protected autonomy. It protected autonomy when it wasn't safe to have it. And when you see this clearly, that internal battle you have been holding, it softens. You stop trying to overpower yourself, and you stop shaming the resistance, and you stop forcing discipline onto dignity wounds. And instead of asking, why can't I just do it? You start asking, what part of me doesn't feel respected here? And that question doesn't weaken you, it restores coherence. And once coherence returns, action stops feeling like self-betrayal. Take a breath. Just one breath. You've been fighting the wrong part, and that is not failure. That is misidentification. And we are correcting it now. And this is usually the moment where people ask, okay, so what do I do now? And I just want to pause this right before that question, because the inner teenager doesn't heal through doing. They heal through being met without being managed. Most of the strategies people instinctively reach for, like programming, reframing, correcting, optimizing, those are exactly what this part learned to resist. And it's not because these things are wrong, it's just because they repeat the original injury. So healing the inner teenager does not require control. It requires respect. And respect sounds very simple, but it is radically different from fixing. It looks like witnessing without correcting. It is letting something just be true without rushing to make it acceptable. It looks like curiosity instead of fixing. Not how do I stop this, but what was this protecting? It looks like respect without control, not overriding, not forcing insight, not demanding a progress, just acknowledging that this part, it had intelligence, even if the strategy is outdated now. And it looks like presence instead of reprogramming. Because the inner teenager doesn't want to be rewritten. They want to be recognized. So this is exact why I am not going to give you any exercise here. No steps, no protocol, no timeline. I just want you to understand how the inner teenager wants to be met. Because this part, it shuts down when it senses agenda. Instead, the work begins with questions. And not questions that you have to answer immediately. And the questions could be like, what did you need then? Not what you should have needed, not what would have been ideal, but what you actually needed. What were you trying to protect? Were you trying to protect your voice, your body, your autonomy, your dignity? Did you silence your truth? And what did it cost you to silence it? And these questions aren't meant to solve anything. They are meant to restore relationships. And when the inner teenager feels listened to without being redirected, something shifts. The resistance softens, the defiance loosens, the shutdown releases its grip, and not because you forced it, but because the nervous system no longer needs to defend identity. This is why healing the inner teenager feels slower, but when you do it, it feels deeper. It feels less dramatic, but it feels more stabilizing because you don't have to overpower yourself. You don't have to discipline this part. You don't have to grow past it. You grow with it. And when dignity is restored, the adult no longer has to fight themselves to move forward. And when the inner teenager is no longer fighting for space, adulthood changes. Confidence becomes quieter. You are not trying to prove yourself. You are not rehearsing your worth. You're not bracing for impact. You move from a place of internal consent. There is less rebellion against yourself, and you stop procrastinating out of defiance. You stop resisting your own plans. You stop sabotaging paths that you actually want. Because following it through, no longer feels like submission. Decisions don't collapse under pressure. You don't second guess. You don't second guess at the last moment. You don't explain yourself into confusion. You don't abandon your truth when someone questions you. You can stay present, even when someone disagrees. And when self trust stops needing evidence, you are not constantly checking, is this okay? Am I allowed? Do I have permission? You move because it is aligned, not because it is validated. And this is what dignity looks like in adulthood. It is not loud, it is not defiant, it is not performative. It is steady. And when the inner teenager feels respected, the adult no longer has to fight themselves. Energy that was tied up in resistance becomes available for creation. Your focus returns, your desire clarifies, your movement feels clean. You don't lose your edge, you reclaim it without turning it against yourself. Growth stops feeling like self betrayal and it starts feeling like self honoring expansion. And this is how you become someone who can move forward without leaving parts of yourself behind. Just take this in, because this is what is possible. And it doesn't require you to become someone else. It just requires you to stop abandoning who you already are. Before we end, I just want to make sure that you are not left alone with what has been named, because for some of you, this may be the first time this part of you has been spoken to. And I don't mean analyzed, not corrected, not softened, but recognized, just spoken to. And that matters more than you think. You do not have to change anything yet. You do not need to confront anyone. You do not need to revisit the past. You do not need to suddenly understand everything. Awareness itself, just awareness itself, is regulation. Being able to see this part without pushing it away, without trying to fix it, that is already calming the nervous system. So if you are feeling a little bit emotional right now, maybe very emotional, that doesn't mean that you are destabilized. It just means something inside you finally felt acknowledged. And you do not need to rush out of this space. You do not need to perform insight. You do not need to be better when you stop listening to this episode. You're allowed to carry this with you quietly into your day, into your conversations, into the moments where you usually override yourself. And when that familiar resistance shows up, that hesitation, that defiance, the self doubt, you do not need to fight it anymore. You can meet it with, I see you. I understand why you are here. This is not the end of the work. It is the beginning of a different relationship with yourself, one that doesn't require self betrayal to grow. Thank you for staying with me in all of this. Thank you for listening, for being willing to see something deeper, for not turning away from yourself. And until I see you next time, I just want to say stay aligned, stay curious, and most important of all, stay true to yourself.